Namaste, I'm Diksha Yadav, your host for What This Means, a Swarajya podcast show where we discuss news behind the news. Joining me today is Sriram Balasubramanian. He's a US based economist and also author of two books, Kautilyanomics, which was also a best selling book, and the latest one, Dharmanomics. Namaste, Sriramji. Welcome to the podcast.
Namaste. Thank you, Diksha. It's great to be here. And I'm an avid reader of Swarajya. In my regards to both Jaggi and Amar as well.
So, Sriramji, let me first ask you this, which you would have answered a lot of times. But yeah, why did you embark on this journey of writing and straight away a trilogy on this topic? And uh, what like kind of got you interested in this? And also, what you felt was missing? Did you feel anything was missing in, say, in the public debates or in the academia?
Yeah, thank you. So, indeed, I think there are a lot of things missing in the public debate and discussion. And the reason why I ventured on a trilogy is to, generally, when you deal with research, you try to publish papers, go through the
Hmm.
academic journal route, and then over a period of time, the ideas percolate, and then it moves shifts into policy making, and then eventually it makes an impact. But that's a multi sort of could be a multi-year, multi-decade process. So I felt that Bharat was is rising at such a spectacular phase, in the sense things are changing so fast that there was really no time,
Hmm.
in my view. So I used a reverse approach, in the sense, I published my books, got all my research, got it to a mainstream audience,
Hmm.
and then as you mentioned, these books are doing well, and they're creating a lot of impact. And then I'm doing the sort of standard journal route in
Hmm.
parallel, which is a sort of a different setup, but I think this topic required that.
Equally
So
important, yeah.
basically, I was, the single biggest research question. I mean, there are two main research questions which I deal with
Mhm.
in my research for the last 10 years or so in these books. The first question is, what is the indigenous Bharatiya economic model? Right. Swarajya, by its name and its history, is meant to provide a sort of an intelligent perspective of ideas, and in that context, I think you'd appreciate this more,
Mhm.
because often the only thing that we talk about in terms of economic history is either Swadeshi or something vague, or something which is very pontificating, right? As if we
Yeah.
have it. I mean, everything in the
Yeah.
past glorious or whatever.
Yes.
But you
Uh,
rarely get a rigorous analytical discussion, right?
True.
So for an objective person, to produce data analysis and things like that. So
Hmm.
that was the first research question, which I asked myself, but I did not get too many answers. The second question really is, what is the role of cultural norms and narratives in
Hmm.
economic choices in today's Bharat? This is again a very important topic, which is often ignored by policymakers sitting in Delhi.
Hmm.
Because see, you had this, especially pre 2014, unlike other fields, where there's a lot of inherent, biases from the colonial past. In the field of
Hmm.
economics, more or less, I mean, the people who led economic policy were
Yeah.
frankly very well-meaning, well-intentioned people, right?
Yes.
But implicitly, they came from a background which is highly Delhi-centric,
Hmm.
okay, highly Latins Delhi-centric, and their education background is
Hmm.
all Anglo-Saxon centric. Basically, I mean,
True.
if you look at the last, set of chief economic advisors, okay,
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
before Krishnamurti Subramanian, before Dr.
Yeah.
KVS, if
Hmm.
you
Hmm.
look at the list of chief economic advisors across independent Bharat, most, if not all of them, are privileged in some form or the other, are Western educated in some form or the other, come from a bureaucratic background, right?
Hmm.
The only sort of aspirational, generation that has come through
Yeah.
starts with Dr. KBS, and then of course now Anand is chief economic advisor, who again doesn't come from you come
Hmm.
from a middle class aspirational background. This is a
Right.
very important point, right? I'm not trying to, I'm trying
Yeah.
to say that because these are guys who did PhDs from, say, Princeton and Stanford in the 1970s, right?
Yeah. Hmm.
When my extended family was below poverty line. My grandmother was,
Hmm.
trying to fight for twice a day food, right?
Hmm.
Whereas, you know, luckily enough, these guys are all very. What I'm trying to say is they come from their perspective, their
More
ideas,
rooted.
they were all benchmarked with a context, right?
Hmm.
Whereas the rest
Hmm.
of the Bharat functions in its own way, right? My
Hmm.
argument is that as you go and travel in Bharat, go to various parts of Bharat,
Hmm.
you realize more and more that there's this dharmic way of life which is
Yeah.
functioning independent of all this, right?
Hmm.
Independent of all these, and that drives a lot of economic choices.
Hmm.
Similarly, at the business corporate level, if you take the top 15, 20 firms in Bharat, they're all
Yeah.
family driven firms. They all
Hmm.
make choices during, based on their own community, based on their own, dharmic priorities.
Hmm.
And that's how these businesses make choices. And at the
Hmm.
policy level as well, this is impactful because if you want to have an impactful policy, uh, something like Swachh Bharat, for example, why is
Yeah.
it more successful in rural areas? Because you're able to through the prime minister's machinery and the scheme, you're able to go and trigger this idea of saucham, which is basically
Hmm.
cleanliness through the dharmic sense, and then create a massive scale based off it, based on the prime minister's machinery and,
Yeah.
and, 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 and the entire system. So it is aligning policy to the way of life. So much so
Hmm.
that now it is an autopilot. You go to most of the villages, except for the main bazaar street, they all
Hmm.
see it as a responsibility to to be clean and create a movement out of it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
these two research questions, to make it brief, were the base of my research, and then a lot of these
Hmm.
things came along the way. And
Hmm.
in the pursuit of these questions, I went into my books and wrote those books, and yeah, this
Yeah.
is the broad context.
Yeah, when you talk about Swachh Bharat and this, I can recall that cleanliness, even when, say, when families were poor, I mean, back having muddy houses or this thing, cleanliness played a huge role. I mean, whatever there was used to be, I mean, I can recall with my grandparents' house, cleanliness was never like accessibility could be there, that there was lack of toilets and this and that, but cleanliness was always. And we have so many festivals which first thing you do is you have to clean the house, and then clean, and then only you can start with, say, puja or something like that. I think, yeah, I mean, what you're saying is policy should be aligned with the way of life, and that would actually, I mean, because naturally people are that way. It's just the.
Yeah, just to add to your point, right? If
Hmm.
there is one thing, consistent theme that you noticed post 2014, at least, I mean, I'm not going into the business of judging that. I'm trying to give a
Hmm. Hmm.
perspective because most people don't understand how the Honorable Prime Minister generally functions, right? But one common thread is that, after Lal Bahadur Shastri,
Yeah.
Narendra Modi ji is the only Prime Minister who
Hmm.
has experienced poverty. It's a very
True.
careful statement that I'm making, right?
Hmm.
Experienced poverty, right?
Yeah.
All the other prime ministers have never experienced poverty. I mean, they might have researched on poverty, they might have done a lot of work on poverty. That's a different story. But
Hmm. Hmm.
really experiencing at an individual level poverty.
Yeah.
So, and also the fact that, for example, in the podcast with Lex Friedman, the prime minister mentions
Yeah.
that, for example, he's traveled to almost 80% of the districts,
Yes.
in the past.
Hmm.
So his, pulse of people and his pulse of this way of life is very high. So that's
Yeah.
why he's able to articulate policy. He's able to understand the importance of a light in a house. He's able to understand the importance of a Ujjwal Yojana. He's able to understand that
Hmm.
people, the dharmic spirit makes them, cross even financial boundaries. So that's why you
Hmm.
have during a pandemic, you have a collective sort of andolan type of a feeling where
Yeah.
you ignite the collective spirit. I call this the
Hmm.
dharmic spirit, to induce people to abide by policies and things like that, right?
True.
So I think
Yeah.
that's again an important point. I just wanted
Yeah.
to add that.
Coming to the temple economy, which is also a very important part of your book, you explain how temple economy or the temples act, function as financial institutions of sorts during, say, uh, in history, right? So, when you what was special about them, and what is the one thing or the lesson that is missing in the present context, how temples function today?
Yeah. So briefly, I mean, of course, I don't want to give spoilers on the book. People who want to read
Hmm.
more can read the book. But there are four major functions of a temple in ancient Bharat. Right. The first function is it served as a major labor aggregator. Okay, which
Hmm.
means it provided employment because of the fact that a temple owned large sections of land, both in terms of agriculture, in terms of the construction activities, in terms of building tier two, tier three towns,
Hmm.
because the temples were there in, even today it's there in major in most of the villages in Bharat. There's one major temple and there's smaller temples around.
Yeah.
So the entire sort of labor aggregation, providing employment to people for all the activities either associated with the temple or associated with the lands which the temple owned, right? Or the affiliated. So it was a major labor aggregator. Second, it played a very important role as a financial institution.
Hmm.
So, Sanjeev Sayalji has argued this before. I've also written in my books earlier that there's a reason why a lot of major temples are within an hour's drive from the coastline. If you take
Hmm.
Somnath in Gujarat, if you
Yeah.
take the Padmanabha Swami temple in Thiruvananthapuram, if you take even the Brihadishwara temple in Tanjavur,
Hmm.
the Jagannath Puri temple in Puri. If you look at all the southern and western temples, except for probably Madurai Meenakshi Amman temple, which is a bit inside, but
Hmm.
otherwise, most of them are somewhere near the coastal area, that is accessible from the coastal areas, right?
Hmm.
Because they served as major financial institution. Besides the religious purpose, they were lending out money to a lot of these guilds. They were called
Hmm.
shrinis. These shrinis were a 2000 plus year old institution, right from the Saraswati Sindhu civilization. I show some evidence in my book on that.
Hmm. Hmm.
But definitely in the Common Era period, they played a very important role in enabling trade. There were these multinational corporations in various places in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam. They had offices in all these places and they were driving maritime trade right from the Middle East as far as Haifa in Israel and all the way till Hanoi in Vietnam, for example, and then China, right? So these Srinis played a very important role, and the temples are financing these Srinis. So the temples used to provide them financing at reasonable rates,
Hmm.
and use the financing money for other activities related to the temple, right? So they played a very important financial institution. Three, they were also these modern day, sort of venture capitalists because they were funding a lot of these local entrepreneurs at the village level and enabling them to drive commerce
Hmm.
and local. For example, the Uttar Pradesh government today has this program called One Product, One Village, right?
Yeah.
Where in each village or each district, one product, one district, I think, they focus on a particular product which is unique to that district, and then they
Yes.
promote it.
Hmm.
Similarly, these temples are promoting local entrepreneurs and local folks in terms of enabling their business and making them better,
Hmm.
right? So that they played a very important role as a VC type of a entity. Lastly, they still play, they played a very important role of a redistributive entity, right?
Hmm.
Again, take a step back, right? When you go to any temple, in those times, especially in the Vijayanagar Empire, it's there in the
Hmm.
Tirumala temple inscriptions, the stories around this. In the Vijayanagar Empire, they sort of institutionalized this concept more, where, a bunch of people in a particular area, rich people, they come together, put in money, and then they create an endowment sort of a thing. This endowment basically runs the temple, right? So the temple is basically run by this entire endowment, and the functionality of the temple, that is its rituals, the agamas, and whatever is required, is given first precedence. And then
Mm-hmm.
uh, anyone who's poor or anyone who wants to come to the temple gets free food for thrice a day, right?
Hmm.
In terms of prasad, right? So that's given free for all of them. So if you really take a step back, this happens even today. But if you really take a step back,
Hmm.
if you really think about it, it is actually a major redistributive mechanism, because what you're doing is
Yeah.
you're taking the money from the rich people in a particular area, using
Yes.
the mechanism of the temple, taking care of its primary purposes, which means the community backs and takes care of its primary purpose of its ritualistic,
Hmm.
because the functionality of temple is important, right? I'll come to
Hmm.
that point a bit later, but that's a very important point, and it takes care of it. And then you are ensuring that the real poor are not starving, that they're given
Hmm.
basic food, basic items. So it takes care of malnutrition, it takes care of a lot of other issues, because you're providing
Yeah.
free food for them. And there's also transfer of wealth, which is happening through this mechanism from the rich to the poor. So
Hmm.
they played a very important role. These are four major roles that happen. In this, it's very important to talk about the functionality of the temple. See, the
Yes.
reason why in Cambodia, when you go to Cambodia, Vietnam today, you still see all these architecture. You still see
Hmm.
Angkor Wat. You still see all these places. But there is a big difference, because all these temples are not functional temples, right? The essence or the you know the charm, beyond the charm, the attraction of the temple is majorly because of its functionality, because it
Yes.
serves its dharmic purpose. I think that's very important. Only when it's functional, only when it's taken care, and when its ritualistic elements are taken care, its power is generated from that, and that's how the rest of the ecosystem which develops is an
Hmm.
offshoot of that. So coming to your question on what is the difference today, I think, look, I've often argued that much of the discussion on the temples, especially in Tamil Nadu, I mean, not just in Tamil Nadu, where it's a
Hmm.
major political issue, in all other states, I think it's rightful. It's important that temples move away from the state, right? That
Hmm.
individual communities need to take care of them. It's their responsibility, and that's how you might have an overarching regulatory framework, but in a sense, the operational elements should be taken. I don't think there's any,
Hmm.
sort of debate on that. Okay, there might be debates on the mechanism of how you're going to do it and how the state
Yeah.
can play a facilitator role. But
Hmm.
unfortunately, this is become a political issue, right?
Yeah.
So the political issue will get resolved through the political process, right? For example,
Yeah.
uh, the BJP has said if they come to power in Tamil Nadu, they will take off, control from the state,
Hmm.
and all these things, right? That has its own process, right?
We have an
But
example in the present context also, no? The Dharmasthala temple, how it functions in
right,
Karnataka.
right.
Uh,
In fact, there is a article. I mean, there's a paper which one of my collaborators was talking about how dharmastalas in Karnataka, contribute to the
hmm.
NBFCs significantly, the
Yeah. Yeah.
non-banking financial corporations in the state.
Yes.
So anyway, so let me just so the point that I'm saying is there is an ecosystem around the temple, right?
Hmm.
The kirana shops, the infrastructure that's developed to get people to come to the temple, the
Hmm.
the tourism that's generated, and the entire, because the temple is so prominent in any major village, its
Yeah.
ecosystem drives a lot of the economic activity, right?
Hmm.
That elements which is beyond the temple, around the temple area, that can be liberated from from the clutches of the state, right? That's not
Yeah.
a because that's not a as hot a political issue as it is. I think there can be consensus on it, where
Hmm.
much of the economic reforms that happened in the 1990s did not happen much at the village decentralized level. So this is another
Hmm.
opportunity, because it enables you to build economies of scale in these tier 2, tier 3 towns, right? Because
Yeah.
eventually there is a constraint. I mean, you live, I presume, in Bengaluru, or you take any major city in Bharat.
Hmm.
They're all extended to tier 2 areas almost, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you eventually have to go to tier 2, tier 3 towns, and
Hmm.
there are already these institutions which are there which can enable commerce around those areas based on their
Hmm.
functionality. All that you
Hmm.
have to do is develop them in an organic, systematic manner, and
Yes.
that will build economies of scale, right?
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
that's the point that I'm trying to make, right? Today, the debate is often a binary debate, right? Whether it's state and the
Yeah.
non-state players, right? that debate should continue, and one hopes that the state
It
moves away
gets.
from it. But that's a
Hmm.
political process, right?
Yeah.
What as policymakers could do is can take a step back and look at the ecosystem around, and
Hmm.
look at strategic ways where you create consensus and liberate these
Hmm. Hmm. I think
the
that
clutches
will
that is preventing.
also solve a one major problem of these, say the shops or the all these economy that generate around the temple. The problem of corruption.
Yeah,
That where government comes in, there's a lot of corruption, and openly people complain about that. So that will also solve this major issue, which people working there do complain about.
yeah, because see, I mean, let's take the Mahakumbh Mela, right? So,
Hmm.
as an example, right? So, in my books, I argue that this dharmic ecosystem is just not the temple. The temple-based economy is one part of it, right?
Yeah.
Then you have the events related to the way of life, something like the Mahakumbh Mela, right?
Yeah.
What in
Yeah.
very simple terms, what's the Mahakumbh Mela? You go to Triveni Sangamam, you take a Ganga Snan, you pray for the welfare of yourself and family and the world, and then you come back, right?
Yeah.
There is no temple involved here, okay?
Yes.
But there
Yes.
are 450 million people or 500 million people who are going to come to this place, come what may, right?
Yeah.
In another, whether you're a nation state or not, whether you are, independent country or not, this has been going for thousands of years, right?
Yes.
So, which means there is what I call highly inelastic demand, right?
Hmm.
Which means that no matter what happens with the external factor, these people are going to end up in the same place for a
Yeah.
particular activity, right?
Yes.
So when they end up in a particular place for an activity, they don't just jump from a parachute, right? They have
Hmm.
to
Hmm.
find transportation. They have to find some sort of way to
Yeah.
come to this place. They need to infrastructure needs to be enabled, and then once they come to the place, just not that place, they will go to two or three towns
Other
nearby.
places.
Combine these activities, and then there's technology, and then there is the entire infrastructure, temporary infrastructure you create, and you know the external infrastructure that you create, right? And just look at the numbers, right? Let's take
Yeah.
the GDP of Uttar Pradesh. State GDP of Uttar Pradesh for 2023-2024 was around
Hmm.
25.8 lakh crores. Okay, the estimate in terms of revenues from Mahakumbh, okay,
Yeah.
the lower estimate is about 2.5 lakh crores. Okay, the higher
Yes.
estimate is about 3 lakh crores. Okay, let's even take an even lower estimate, right, which is 1.5 to 2 lakh crores.
Hmm.
So this makes up at least 5 to 10% of the state's GDP, right?
Yes.
It's a 45-day event.
Hmm.
Imagine, especially during a time when there's a recession,
Hmm.
or when there's a time there's a consumption downfall. This is a
Yeah.
huge trigger, not just for the state's economy, for the nation's economy. So, Chief
Yes.
Economic Advisor Dr. Ananta Nageshwaran recently mentioned that
Hmm.
they are expecting the estimates for the last quarter GDP numbers to be much higher at 7.2% or 7.5%.
Yes.
Bloomberg had reported, compared to
Yeah.
5.8%.
Hmm.
So, Mahakumbh is a once in a generation event, right? But this provides you a very good template of how you could have a calibrated, you know, uh, targeted response to such events or such
Hmm.
dharmic activities to boost local economies of scale.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
irrespective of how the macro environment is, these people are still going to go to this place. Okay, they might not spend as much compared to before, but this is a great opportunity to revive animal spirits, put it that way, in,
Yes.
in economic
Yes.
terms.
Hmm.
Yeah. So I think this is another angle one needs to look at.
One more problem that temple face. So the examples that you suggest in your books, and do they provide a solution to the problem that temples face today? Like you mentioned Mahakumbh, but the temple did not involve temple, but it was an event, or even during festivals we see the temples do feel that kind of rush. So the problem temple faces the scale at which devotees show up, or the scale of say even the chadhavas, apart from offerings, then the scale of say management, or the scale of everything, it's huge, right? And how does it do that? The Can we learn something, and is there any lesson to handle this scale of things?
Yeah,
Because
see,
from say Vaishno Devi to say Tirupati to even Jagannath Puri, or now even Kashi Vishwanath or Ayodhya, the crowd that comes in is still, many feel, is not uh, manageable. I mean, there has to be a lot of things done to manage the kind of crowd show up every day.
that's true. So that's where I'm talking about more targeted, more focused approach, right? I mean, at the moment it's very ad hoc, right?
Hmm.
In the sense you there is debate, there is discussion, but among babus and bureaucrats, it is
Hmm.
still uh, an idea that is that people are floating it, but still not convincing enough. Perhaps they're waiting for some certification from the white man. I don't know, but um, but on a so it has to be that's precisely what I'm talking about, right? These events are not, people need to start viewing them as huge economic enablers, that there has to be a strategic understanding. For example, I feel that the Mahakumbh itself was really not capitalized by the corporate sector. I mean, can you really imagine? I mean, there are many companies who made an effort, especially in the AI and technology space. But you're
Hmm.
having a market of 450 million people in a particular area for 45
Hmm.
days. I mean,
Yeah.
it's such a huge singular market for
Hmm.
anyone related to advertising, marketing, or any other field. So I
Hmm.
think
Hmm.
there has to be greater awareness and greater sort of coordination between the private sector, public sector, on how do you build economies of scale, right?
Hmm.
Around this,
Hmm.
it's important that one shouldn't dilute the sanctity of this, right? There's a difference
Yeah.
between commercialization of a particular dharmic event
Hmm.
and expanding the commercial potential of the offshoots of the dharmic event, right?
Yes.
I'm talking about the latter, right?
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
the the dharmic event has to be, done, in my view, maintain the sanctity, don't done its own, ritualistic, or whatever is required, do it in the most sanctifiable manner, right?
Hmm.
But the economies of scale that comes out of it could be really expanded. And how do you do it in a targeted manner? I think that what we are missing here is a very reasonable debate, and that's what my books try to push through,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
push the needle. Because all I'm saying is you have to have a mature argument, you have to have a mature
Yeah.
view that these are driving economies of scale. These are not
Hmm.
small entities, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So they have significant impact, and they need to be viewed through that prism.
One example I can think of is Asian. I think it was Asian Paints or some cement that they were doing, like, because lot of in the at Mahakumbh, lot of people get lost, get separated from their families and all. So they had taken one approach there of connecting people or finding and whoever was separated. Similarly, I think, like you mentioned, corporates in from marketing sense, they could have pitched in, say, in cleanliness thing, because such a huge
No,
thing
because
is
see,
coming, or not just around Mahakumbh. People were coming and driving from, say, even Kerala. Traffic jam was there even in Madhya Pradesh border. So throughout the route, that can could have been a good way of you know what you're saying,
see,
approach.
another thing is that, right, you need to also understand how the informal sector is still the core of the Bharatiya economy, right?
Hmm.
I'm not
Hmm.
romanticizing the informal sector, right? I believe that firms need to be bigger, they need to scale up. I'm all for all that,
Yeah.
right? But there is something called the reality, right? So, for example, if you read Lilliput Land by Professor Rama Bijolkar, it's a very interesting book.
Hmm.
Um, you notice that in the last 30 years, I mean, we have liberalized since the early 1990s, right? If you look at the last 30, 35 years, or 30
Hmm.
years, the number of informal firms have, in fact, increased if you look at the
Hmm.
quantity of the informal firms. And the informal firms have not really transformed, significantly, right?
Hmm.
One devil's advocate views that, okay, look, you've not provided them the labor laws, you've not provided them the, all the necessary policies to enable them to grow, which is a fair point.
Hmm.
But there's also another contrarian perspective which should be given due credit, or at least due voice, is
Hmm.
that the informal sector likes to work in its own way. I mean, for example, if you really look at the entire digital transformation, the informal
Hmm.
tech sector has really picked up the digital transformation,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Most of them are digitally aligned, right? Most of them use these apps and all these things to enable their commerce and do it. For example, the entire commerce space has moved from. I mean, the entire mall story has been bypassed, more or
Yeah.
less, because the malls are now diminishing returns now,
Hmm.
but still the informal sector has withstood this onslaught of the malls and now moved on to the digital sector, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So what I'm trying to highlight here is there is a reality of the Bharatiya economy which is right there, right? And
Hmm.
all of
Hmm.
these institutions work on things like community trust, this dharmic way of life that I'm talking about. Because
Hmm.
we make
Hmm.
economic choices, whether you're buying a laptop today or you bought a boat, say 5,000 years ago,
Hmm.
you still have certain parameters, one, two, three, for making that economic choice.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
argue that that is more or less aligned to your upbringing, your dharmic way of life.
Hmm.
That decides the choice. If someone is not going to buy a particular product on a particular day during a
Hmm.
particular time, okay,
Yeah.
you would still do that thousands of years back.
Hmm.
So the economic choices at the individual level is still determined by this way of life, especially in Bharat.
Hmm.
There's a lot of research on this in Asian societies, in China, in Japan. This is quite prevalent. Even in the Anglo-Saxon world, though this impact is not as much, there's still a lot of research. But Bharat is the land which has this most impact. It's a throughout the year phenomenon, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
At the individual level. At the corporate level, I already mentioned earlier, right? In terms of how businesses make choice. For example, Mukesh Ambani was telling Jensen Huang that he starts new projects during Diwali.
Yeah.
The Mumbai Stock Market Exchange follows
Yeah.
the Vedic
That.
calendar, actually, not the Gregorian
Yes.
calendar, in terms of
Hmm.
when the holidays come, when they're going to make investments, right?
When they are not going to buy a house, that
Correct. So, for example,
that
I'll give you
months.
another example, right? In Tamil Nadu, during the month of Margazhi, which is between
Yeah.
mid of December till mid of January, before
Hmm.
Thai begins. Thai is in the Tamil month. Most communities don't have marriages during this time.
Yeah.
Okay,
Same in
so the
North. It's
so
particular months.
so the entire wedding industry, for example, during the Chaturmasya time,
Yeah.
most of the so during all these
We-
pockets of calendars of time, our way of life
yeah.
plays a very important economic role.
Yes.
So the economic cycle is actually aligned to this way of life, right? So
True.
if you want to really understand the Bharatiya consumer, you
Hmm.
have to understand this way of life. And
Hmm.
I'm arguing through my past books and my future book, which I'm working on, that that the past, there is 1,000+ year old, or more than that, civilizational experience which is producing the
Hmm.
present moment.
Hmm.
It's not something that just hijacked somewhere. So
Yes.
unless you try to come to terms with this and align policy to this way of life, okay, your efficiencies of policy execution will still be limited. So
Yeah.
Swachh Bharat became 80-90% more effective in rural areas because it is aligned to this way of life.
Hmm.
If you're not aligned to this way of life, you'll be stuck with the 50-60% efficiency. So
Right.
if you're a policymaker and you really want to enhance policy, right,
Hmm.
you'll be wise to look at this way of life and try to understand it. And that's
Yes.
what my books are trying to put you. Because
Hmm.
mind you, right, even today, the informal sector provides 85% of employment in this country. Okay.
Yeah.
For all the talk about, all that we
Government
talk
jobs.
about, the flashy business media headlines of whatever the formal sector is, bottom line
Hmm.
is it's producing less than 15% of employment in this country,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So if you really want to address the issue of employment, you have to address the informal sector and expand economies of
Yes.
scale there. And for you to do that, you need to understand how communities work at the ground level. So, for example,
True.
if a small kirana shop goes bust, no
Hmm.
one's going to go to the. I mean, most people. What happens when a small kirana shop goes bankrupt? Right. The first thing
Hmm.
that person will do is someone in their local community or their families will pull in some money. Okay,
Hmm.
and there'll be some social sort of security within the family, which will
Yeah.
put in money, and that will enable commerce to happen. Okay,
Yes.
enable a resolution of this debt to happen. Okay, that doesn't happen. They go to a local person whom they know. He might charge exorbitant rates or whatever it is. And if
Hmm.
this doesn't happen, then they move to the bank.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
this level of community development is what drives the informal sector. So one needs to understand. And again, look,
Hmm.
this I want to make it clear, right? The two major points, right? First point is this is not romanticizing the informal sector. Far from it.
Hmm.
I am trying to tell that look, this is the reality you're confronted with,
Yes.
right? If you
Hmm.
really want to change this, build economies of scale, make
Hmm.
these businesses bigger, you need to do more research to understand this way of life, right?
Hmm.
The second point is this is not something very unique. This is not that only Bharat has. You look at
Hmm.
all other aspirational societies, China, Japan, even the
Yeah.
United States. The modern day capitalism is an offshoot of a Protestant ethic. All these
Hmm.
guys have some indigenous models, indigenous way of life driving their societal and economic policy.
Yeah.
So it's high time that we
Yeah.
take cognizance of this and
Hmm.
also look at elements of this to address economic challenges and provide solutions.
Interesting. Shriramji, you also mentioned about dharmic capitalism, right? And capitalism, of course, is, has a kind of a negative connotation and considered bad when it, like, especially in media, in politics, in student life as well, like whatever we are fed while growing up, until and unless we enter the job market, that shift or to, understanding the positive aspect of capitalism happens. So, how is dharmic capitalism, say, different from the current understanding of capitalism or the Western capitalism?
Okay, so when I had formulated this terminology in my first book, uh, you know, before people jump on me,
Hmm.
which often Twitterati and general people do, is that
Hmm.
look, it was a I wouldn't say innocent, but it was a conscious. What I was trying to say is that look, beyond the state and the market, the role of dharma plays an important role in driving economic choices. Thousands of
Hmm.
years back, I would say even today, right? So this base, this foundation of dharma, played an important role in any model that was there, in my view, right?
Hmm.
So the modern day equivalent is the capitalistic model. But even in the capitalistic model, which is involving both the state and the market, which I mentioned, the role of dharma plays a very good enabler in terms of addressing the issues in the state as well as the market, right? So this is what I led me to this idea of dharmic capitalism. Of course, in this book, I broaden it to Dharmanomics, which
Hmm.
is probably a more ideal term. But I define dharma again through ethics, responsibilities, and harmony. Right? Again, dharma has many definitions.
Hmm.
You could write many books on dharma. Okay, but I'm primarily talking about samanya dharma. It is your
Hmm.
conventional, in Tamil we call laukika life, which is your commercial
Hmm.
life. In that, for the comfort or for the um, simplification for a policy oriented audience,
Hmm.
I define it through ethics, responsibilities, and institutions. And these map on to ideas such as clean governance, clean leadership,
Hmm.
open engagement with the rest of the world in terms of ideas, sustainable growth and welfare, responsibility based approach at the family level, societal level, environmental level, and the role of a state, which is, I argue that Kautilya had three main pillars, which is the role of a state which is
Hmm.
strong but not micromanaging, engaging the rest of the world in terms of commerce, in terms of, and all that, and then
Hmm.
sustainable growth and welfare. So, these is how I
Yeah.
define Dharma, Dharmic capitalism and
So,
Kautilyanomics. And then in Dharmanomics, I take it a bit further. I say there are elements of Kautilya's Dharmic capitalism in these common era kingdoms. And then there's the temple based economies, the Dharmic ecosystem. And then the Srini Dharmas. which is corporate guilds and their sort of financing. That's the broader umbrella of Dharmanomics. So that's how I've evolved. So there is no, I wouldn't say, you know, I understand the modern day, gripe about all this,
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
eventually you have to, frame ideas which can relate to common people. And I think
Hmm.
it was done in that spirit. Yeah.
Considering the present situation, with the U.S. President Donald Trump coming in, that the whole tariff reforms that he's up to, and then of course the very competitive, say, trade war, tech war going on between U.S. and China. Amid all this, how does a dharmic way or dharmanomics can help, India grow in this such a competitive environment?
Yeah, look, I think the best way to approach this is, what I call a principles based approach, right? You know,
Hmm.
we already have certain systems in place, right? Institutions, systems, and all these things. Uh, there are two ways where we can, I think, push the needle. One is what I call a principles based approach, which means how do these dharmic principles apply to key policy decisions, right? When you're
Hmm.
facing a quandary, when you're facing an issue, a dilemma, right? How do you use some of these ideas based on ethics, responsibilities, institutions? The entire idea of Atmanirbharta, self resilience, engaging with the world. So, using all these
Hmm.
principles for individual policy choices is one way to approach it, right? That's a that's a big picture view of things. The other way is there are specific policy issues. Specific is like something like Swachh Bharat, right? A
Hmm.
specific policy outcome. You want to deal with that outcome. You view the challenges in that for achieving that outcome through the prism of this dharmic model
Hmm.
and look at solutions through the dharmic lens.
Yeah.
So and then you make policies in a way which is aligned to this, so that for
Hmm.
that particular outcome that you're seeking, you're having a more efficient. You know, this is sort of a completely decentralized approach
Hmm.
or
Hmm.
policy to policy approach. There are two ways to do this. One is the big picture, which I spoke about. So
Hmm.
this applies to any issue. See, it could be Trump's
Hmm.
tariffs. It could be because eventually the questions that one people ask,
Hmm.
the answers lies in the how you deal with some of these principles, right, and apply
Yeah,
these principles.
because we have seen with Prime Minister Modi, any global platform or any time he speaks, he makes a point to mention the Indic roots or the culture or ideas that Bharat you know represents. So all that is there, and we have seen it in the actions also. Like even when he talks about world is one family and things like that. Uh, we saw during COVID times, India provided COVID vaccines to many nations, or the diplomatic ties which is like good with every country and things like that. But there's this many people or many takers of how Trump is functioning now, right? They say, what do we get out of all of this? It's we should be aggressive, or like like how he's dealing with things one after another when it comes to economy to fix it, taking decisions one after the other, and not thinking like not going slow, in the sense they equate all these things with say sustainable growth with a slow growth. Would you agree to this
No,
thought?
look, I think comparisons are inevitable, but also very unfair
Hmm.
because the dynamics are very different. See, Bharat is a 1.4 billion people. It's it has cultural shifts every 20 miles, right? Different
Yeah.
languages, different people. So
Hmm.
it's a level of complexity which is way different to the United States, right? And the
Yeah.
United States has a, this is what I call it. Bharat has a sattvic dynamic, right?
Hmm.
So and the United States doesn't have a sattvic; it's more of a rajasic dynamic, right?
Hmm.
So imagine someone like Trump running in Bharat, right? He wouldn't probably even win a local election, right? Because
Yeah.
a lot of the factors that he brings to the table are very anathemical to the Bharatiya spirit, right?
Hmm.
Similarly, if a Narendra Modi was to run here, of course, Modi ji might adapt himself, but
Hmm.
given all these things, I don't know whether it will really, align to the spirit of what the US actually is, right? So
Yeah.
why I'm trying to mention this is direct comparisons become very difficult, right?
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
think what is important to understand is, you know, what are the nation's interests at this particular point of time, right?
Hmm.
At this cycle of development. Are these interests taken care by some of the actions that are being done, right?
Hmm.
And I think
Hmm.
nation first is a very important principle for any leader who wants to govern for any country, in my view, right? Because eventually you want their national interest to be reflected, right?
Hmm.
And how do you sort of protect your national interest in the bigger scheme of things? Because everything is fluid,
Yeah.
right? Dynamic. So I think time will tell us how this evolves.
Yeah.
But I think the barometer which people should use, in my view, at
Hmm.
least, is to look at themselves in the context of the world and see how they
Hmm.
can contribute to the world as well as develop themselves. And I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
direct comparisons is good for Twitter discussions, but I think for serious policy engagement, I think a very measured
Hmm.
approach to dealing with some of these issues, especially when they are
Hmm.
in flux so much, would be, I think, wiser and to do.
I had this another question. I mean, might be digressing a bit, but when we look at the history, right, we see whatever we read and we learn from it is that at very young age, people like at very young age, students were given like imparted knowledge, and at very like young age, they started taking up responsibilities. And still, when you read about them, you never feel like they were running out of time, right? They were not running away from responsibilities as well towards their soil, people, work, or family, or things like that. So do you think, present context, if you see, uh, we learn everything at a certain age and everything, and still like we always feel we are running out of time. Do you think this is also something that is a western gift to us?
I think, look, I think more and more that, especially in the last 15, 20 years, we realize that, because see, there has been a section of India post 1990 reforms,
Hmm.
which has already become high income, super high income, the entire cycle in terms of education, Western education, Ivy League education, whatever it is. You name
Hmm.
it, they've all done that, right? There is a section. Might be a small section, but there's a section. So for that section, from my if you look at my dad's generation, right, or your
Hmm.
parents' generation, their main purpose, especially in the 60s, 70s, was to get out of poverty.
Yeah.
That was their primary purpose for most families. Somehow
Hmm.
get out of poverty, right? Go to the city, get yourself employed, you know, move away from poverty, right? So once that moved, then you come to the post 1990 generation,
Hmm.
which has already reached this small section has already reached so-called luxury at some level, right? In terms of
Hmm.
education, social standing, whatever it is. But there's still a vacuum. This leads them to go back to their past, try to understand their past, and and see all this. And we realize
Hmm.
that most of the things that we see today, whether it's sustainability, climate change, science, whatever it is, we come from a very illustrious past, economics, as I
Hmm.
argue. So that builds a sense of curiosity and confidence as people seek this more and more, right?
Hmm.
So this needs to go further, because
Hmm.
eventually the these sort of confidence in yourself and your civilization will lead to more indigenous, not necessarily spirit, but also innovative solutions to a lot of modern day problems, right?
Hmm.
And then this time dynamic that you're talking about will eventually evaporate, because you will be doing things on your own terms, right?
Hmm.
You'll be comfortable running a startup without going to school, and then doing well. Or you might have someone do PhD and multiple PhDs and still be happy with in their lives. So I think we are going through a process. It's rapid change that is happening, and eventually I think we will come
Hmm.
to an equilibrium where society as a whole will try to align itself. My
Hmm.
my thesis is that it will align itself to the way of life. The way of life, the dharmic way of life, is going to be there for another thousands of years. Okay,
Yeah.
and my view is that is the equilibrium,
Hmm.
and people will fall into that equilibrium more sooner than later.
But dharmic way of life, it has. the main, the this thing is that it has you have this ethics and moral play a major role, right? When we talk about this, and you mentioned in your book also Dharmanomics, and but in today's time the problem is that we see that this ethics is decreasing. The ethics and morals are like decreasing in, say, even uh, government governance, with corruptions and everything that we see, or even in family systems, or say in educations, or school. So don't you think this is like a bigger challenge to deal with? I mean, to come back to the fundamentals and ethics and moral.
No, look, I'm not looking at a personal level, right? I'm not even talking about the individual and the family level. I'm not sort of pontificating anything of that sort, right?
Hmm.
Purely from a policy standpoint, I'm just observing and seeing this happening. Okay, I'm
Hmm.
seeing this way of life is essentially dictating a lot of economic choices that Bharatiyas make.
Hmm.
Okay, I'm not even taking a judgment on whether this should be the model, or this should be the or I'm not even taking a judgment on whether this is right or wrong. Okay, personally,
Hmm.
I might take a judgment. That's a different story. But
Yeah.
in a purely policy discussion, I'm not taking a judgment on that. I'm just saying
Hmm.
this is how it is, whether you like it or not. Okay,
Yeah.
as a policymaker, you want policies to have effective outcomes. Simple. Okay,
Hmm.
how do you, whatever policies that you want that to be efficient, you want that to reach its particular goal.
Hmm.
I'm saying that, look, if you want to reach that particular goal, you have to understand this way of life first,
Hmm.
and then expand economies of scale related to this way of life. Then you'll reach your particular goal, whatever those
Yeah.
goals are, assuming it's aligned. Okay,
Hmm.
so this is the broad outlook, right? Whether individuals, are, I'm not looking at the individual. So that's why I mentioned Samanya Dharma, right?
Hmm.
Which is, I would say a more commercial way of living, and how to inbuild these values into the way of living. Of course, there's no society which is 100% corrupt free, and there is no, at any point of time there will be corruption. The question really is, how do you deal with such outcomes? How do you mitigate them? How do you reduce them?
Hmm.
So logically speaking, if these elements of dharma which we talk about is enhanced and built, like what Kautilya said many centuries ago,
Hmm.
they will result in a society which is far more egality, far more sustainable, and it will get you onto the path of you know establishing an indigenous perspective to things. So I think
Yeah.
that's the worldview I come from. And of course, I'm not saying that you this will solve all the problems, but I think if you're going to be a superpower, or you're aspiring to be a superpower, you have
Hmm.
to first fix, or you have to first understand what your way of life is and how it's impacting economic outcomes.
Hmm. Right. So first step is fixing the policy and aligning it to the Dharmanomics, or the Dharma way of life, is what
Or at least
your.
be conscious about it, right? It's not
Hmm.
like, just a bunch of guys sitting in Delhi articulate some policy which just,
Hmm.
and boom, it becomes effective, right? Rule of,
Hmm.
okay, rule of law and order is very important, right? Kautilya even says this, right?
Yeah.
But he says dharma supplements the rule of law and order.
Hmm.
Responsibilities is an important supplement to an effectiveness of rule of law and order,
Yeah.
right? So dowry was outlawed in this country in the 1950s.
Hmm.
Do we all agree that dowry still exists today? Of course it does.
Yeah.
So if rule of law and order was the only sort of parameter,
Hmm.
okay, then dowry should have been eliminated by now.
Yes.
So I think there is a case where the role of these elements of dharma can play an
Hmm.
important substitute, important complement, not substitute, important complement to legacy systems, in institutions,
Hmm.
and then firm up the goals of these institutions.
Hmm.
So they're not replacing these institutions, in my view; they're supplementing them, and I think
Right.
that's an important point.
Lastly, two questions. One is, despite having such an amazing pool of talent, why India has not been able to, say, produce a journal of international quality, especially in science or economics yet.
I think eventually these things will come because we are going through a developmental phase where it's a huge transitional phase. We have
Hmm.
moved so many people out of poverty in the last 15 years, 10, 15 years, extreme poverty, right? Eventually we are seeing a lot of improvements and being our ideas resonating, especially in the global sphere, on a
Hmm.
variety of issues. I think education will also follow suit. I think the NEP is a good step, in my
Hmm.
view, personal view, that it takes you in the right direction. And I think eventually these things take time.
Hmm.
And for a country of our scale, it might not be to the pace that we want. But I think eventually, as long as we invest in the principles that and systems, first principles which we spoke about, I feel
Hmm.
these things will naturally come over a period of time.
Lastly, Shriramji, if you can suggest top five or seven, say, authors or figures of history or case studies that our listeners can, read to uh, develop, I mean, understand or develop knowledge, more knowledge in, of Dharmanomics.
Okay, so that's I wouldn't say challenging
Appa-
question, but it's making me think.
One
But
can be
okay,
your book and Kautilya, but yes,
sure. I mean,
apart from.
let's leave my books aside. But yeah, there are three. Okay, I dedicate this book to Dr. Nagaswamy, late archaeologist, Neelkant Shastri, and K.T. Neelkant Shastri, and also Shama Shastri. So Shama Shastri is the one who discovered the Arthashastra from and then translated the first translation, more recent translation. And
Mhm.
then K.T. Neelkant Shastri has done a lot of work on southern kingdoms. And then Dr. Nagaswamy, of course, is a legend on many accounts. So these three people, I would say, books by them are might be boring for the young generation, but look, if you really want to understand, spend
Yeah.
time and read this, you'll get some perspective. And then purely from an economic standpoint, Balbir Sihag ji, he wrote a book on Balbir Sihag. He's a former PhD from MIT. He wrote
Hmm.
an academic book on how Kautilya was far ahead of Adam Smith, and he argued that Kautilya was the founder of economics. He's
Hmm.
one of the people who inspired me to work on my Kautilyanomics series. His book is again I would say an important game changer for people who want to have a serious discussion on such subjects.
Yeah.
And lastly, probably my books. I mean, I don't want to you know, congratulate, but I think my books provide you a perspective. You might
Hmm.
disagree, agree, think I'm a crazy guy, whatever it is, but at least I bring an idea to the table, right?
Hmm.
And I make Swarajya, engage on these ideas. And I think what my books, at least from what I like to believe, is that they make the author, they make the reader think,
Mhm.
contemplate, and discuss ideas. And then
Yeah.
that's the main purpose. As long as that is, done. So I would suggest, yeah, my books if you're keen. So these are probably some suggestions I would do if you want to get perspective of Dharmanomic sense.
Thank you so much, Shriramji, and I really hope your book, more and more people read your book, and especially books like yours. I think they should become a common knowledge, right? The information that's there should become a common knowledge and not be limited to, say, academic circles or to people who have interest in, say, history or economics. It should become a common knowledge, and every citizen should know how Bharat is and was. Thank you so much for this conversation and for your time.
Sure, and thank you again to Swarajya for hosting me. I hope more of your listeners read the book, review it, in all the public platforms, Amazon and a few other places. And also, do share your thoughts and feedback. Would love to use it for my subsequent books as well.
Sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, listeners,
Thanks.
for tuning in. If you're listening to this episode on Spotify, do follow and read the show. And link to the book will be added in the description on all the channels. Thank you so much.